Hey there everyone, this is Dirt Bike Channel. I'm your host Kyle Brotherson, and today we're going to be reviewing the 2020 and the 2021 KTM XCW line. I've got a 300 here. I had a 300 before that I gave away, and I want to review that right now. I should mention before we get started that I pay full price for all my bikes, and I don't work for the manufacturers. I don't care what the manufacturers think of me. I'm saying my mind on these things. I'm speaking my mind. If they screw up, they screw up. If they do good, they do good. You guys are who I'm working for, because I'm trying to give you guys the perspective of the common man who lives with these bikes and rides these bikes and puts a few parts on them and just goes out there and having a good time. I'm working for you, not the manufacturer. So if I say things that get the manufacturers like, panties in a ruffle, too bad. So yeah, I realized I actually hadn't done a full wrap-up review on the 2020 KTM XCW line. I gave one away a couple months ago, but I never actually did a full review on it. I did a number of videos where I talked about good and bad or whatever. Actually, I just did a video where I talked about the bad, and then I just praised it while I was riding it. But I wanted to give you guys a review of it. Now, please excuse the fact that this is a dusty bike. I usually don't show you dusty bikes, but I didn't wash it because I thought I was gonna ride it like 2 days later, and then it snowed like 1,000,000 feet in my yard, and so it's here in the shop and it's dusty. But the thing I wanted to say is the 2020 and the 2021 bikes are so stinking similar. All they really did in 2021 is update the plastics. They gave you some gray plastics rather than black plastics. I like the black better, but hey, in 2021, they went with gray, but that's essentially the only changes that I've really been able to tell in the hours that I've put on the 2020 versus the 2021. I also want to say that for the first time since 2014, I feel like I personally don't want to live without an XCW. For so long, when I got my 2015 KTM XC bike, a 300 XC bike, I kind of moved over, and there's some advantages to the XC bikes. And I thought, I'm an XC fan, and I still am an XC fan, but what I'm saying is they made some changes in 2020 to these bikes, which basically made it so that I do not want to live without one of these bikes, because so much of my riding in the last few years has gotten slower and more technical and nasty. And that's where this bike really shines because of a few things which we're going to get into. So I feel like I've got to have an XC bike. I've got a 250 XC, and then I got this 300 XCW, and it's kind of the best of both worlds. And I'll talk about why I feel like I cannot live without this thing. Real quick, let's talk about the things that they changed from the model year of 2019 into 2020 and then carried over to 2021, the things that I'm very, very excited about. The best things about it that they changed are all in the frame. The geometry of this bike got so much better. It was a brand new frame for 2020, and they carried it over to the 2021s, and it feels more balanced to me than ever before. Gone are the days of the XCWs with the high kind of like stink bug back end, and they had kind of weird knifing issues with the front end. Those issues are gone. It is the most balanced front to back XCW that they've ever made, and I just absolutely loved it. That was the biggest change for me. The forks, they also did some valving in the forks. I think the forks that came on the 2020s and the 2021s are the best forks that KTM has put on any of their XCWs. It is so soft and is so plush, it just absorbs all of those stiff edges, all those sharp edges when you're going slow. But it also can get out there and move too. This bike can absorb the nasty stuff and get that fork moving and absorb those bumps and absorb those rocks and ledges and stuff, but it can also go out there and pound whoops. So it's a pretty cool mix. I mean, it's not gonna be the best bike at pounding whoops, but it does it actually really, really well. They did some really, really cool things with that. Another big change that they made, at least for me, is the fuel mapping on the EFI system, the TPI system from 2019 over to 2020, and then maybe even refined it a little bit in 2021, is these bikes start so much better. See, the 2019 bikes were really, really cold-blooded. They didn't want to start. Whereas the 2020 bikes, every one of them that I've been around, they've been much, much better at starting. And the 2020s were much better at starting, and this 2021 is even a little bit better. I feel like even the 2020 2021 fuel mapping is even a little bit richer, a little bit more fuel than the 2020s. And so they've continued to massage that, and the bikes run awesome. The other thing is the ambient air pressure sensor that came into these bikes in 2020, it just works. They have not skipped a beat for me, and that has been really, really cool. The motors have been really snappy, although every one of these bikes is an individual, so they don't all run the same. And you might get your bike and you'd be like, hey, this thing's kind of muted. And so there's a couple things you can do. You can take that little key and adjust your power valve a little bit. I go quarter turns. Every one of those things is a little different, so you tune them accordingly depending on how that motor delivers power and how you want the power to come on. The other thing you can do is you can adjust your throttle cam. They come with a gray cam inside these things typically. It's a more mellow cam. If you want it to hit a little bit harder, you can put the black cam in there, and that makes a big difference. So you get the bike and you tune it a little bit. So while I don't want to live without one of these XCWs like I mentioned, and if you put everything out on a spreadsheet and you assigned, 50 different components to a bike, and then you gave them a value from 1 to 10, these KTMs are going to probably score higher. In my opinion, they're going to score higher on aggregate than any of the other manufacturers out there. There are some things about these bikes, these 2020 and 2021 KTMs, that I think need to be improved, and so I want to go through that here. First thing I want to mention, and this is in no particular order, and I've griped about this stuff before, but first thing I want to mention is the rear fender. The rear fender, the way that these things hook up and the way that all the plastics come together on the XCWs and on the XCs is just ridiculous. The first time you loop the bike out, everything pops apart, and there's like these little, these little nubs down in there that just pull off, and there's a way better way to design it. You don't have a good place to grab onto the thing to pull it over, so you're having to install some sort of a strap or whatever. There's a way better way to do this. KTM has done it better in their older models, and I think that they really need to redesign that rear fender design on these bikes. Another thing, I'm gonna keep griping about it, is they don't have a kickstart. We want a backup kickstart on these bikes. It's good enough for your race teams. Your race teams wanna have a backup Kickstarter, but you're taking it away from us. I understand you'll probably take it away. Eventually, it's down here where you can split the cases and put a kickstart kit in it and stuff, and KTM is gonna think no one buys it and no one cares, and we just wanna save weight and whatever. That's garbage. We would like to have the backup Kickstarter on the bike if we can keep it, please, please, please. That is something. Another thing that needs to be changed is the fact that these, somewhere around, 20, 50% of these bikes have a little bit of a leak down in the power valve area. I don't know how many of them have it, but I know a significant number of them have it. None of the bikes I have here currently, this bike and the bike out of the frame, the two 2021 bikes, they're not leaking yet, but it is something that's super annoying. It's transmission fluid that leaks out there because of a bad gasket. The gasket that you changed to in 2020 is a lot more faulty than the 2019 gasket, and it doesn't appear that you changed it for 2021. You need to fix that so we don't have leaking power valves down there. Something else that's pretty stupid is the air bypass screw. Now I understand that we all have to kind of understand that TPI came to us because KTM is selling and creating too many bikes, and they have to adhere to the Euro 5 standards in Europe for emissions. And so a lot of that stuff kind of came tumbling with it. Here's the thing though, KTM, and the guys, the only way that KTM has given us to adjust our idle on these bikes, unless we do some modifications, is an air bypass screw on there. The problem with that air bypass screw is all it really does is make the bike leaner. So yes, that will increase your idle, but it makes the bike leaner. So most people, a lot of people, are taking that glued in screw, because they actually glued in the idle screw. We're taking our throttle bodies apart, ungluing that screw, putting an aftermarket idle screw in there so that then we can adjust our idle circuit independently, and that's something that needs to be fixed on these bikes. I've said it before and I've said it again, but they need to come with spark arresters. Most of these bikes are being used on public land, and it's a good idea to have a spark arrestor if you're not on a motocross track, and so they could easily give us spark arresters. Something else that needs to be addressed is, although they dropped the radiators down a few years back, and that makes it easy if the radiator gets pushed back to sever, to make a little hole, a puncture in your lower radiator hoses. We've kind of termed it the power valve puncture because it's your power valve down there on that side of the motor that comes and like puts a little stress cut in the in the hose down there. So there needs to be some better bracing to help those radiators stay forward, or just a redesign of where the hoses are in the radiator, so in that area, so that it doesn't get cut and cut your ride short. The last thing I'll say about these bikes is they need to come stock with a capacitor. So what are you saying, Kyle? This bike in its stock form, the XCWs, will not bump start on a dead battery because it doesn't have a capacitor. The funny thing about this is the XC bikes, which is why I have one right here outside of the frame, the XC line does have a capacitor in it, so it will bump start on a dead battery. You'd think it'd be the other way around, because isn't this the bike that's supposed to be doing got the wide ratio gearing, going wide out into these crazy places? You'd think this bike would have a capacitor. It doesn't, so you have to put an aftermarket capacitor in this bike so that it will bump start on a dead battery, which is very, very important in my opinion. So now let's talk about some of the amazing things about these XCW bikes, both the 2020s and the 2021s. These are the tightest turning bikes that I have ever owned and that I have ever ridden, other than my trials bikes. You can take your steering stops out up here on the front, and because they lower those radiators down, this bike will turn super tight. And that is awesome in the really, really nasty stuff. The more that I practice full lock turning drills, and the more I practice static balance drills on my trials bikes and things, the more I become accustomed to being able to crank those bars and keep my balance. And I love the fact that I can get such good turning radius on a bike like this. Really helps for tight switchbacks, really helps for just the technical and nasty stuff. If you're always going flat out super fast, it doesn't matter. But since so much of my riding on a bike like this is super slow, that really tight turning radius is a lifesaver. Plug for the smooth TPI motors. I understand there are some people out there that don't like the way the power comes on these TPI bikes. You want your bike to run a certain way with a carburetor. You've gotten used to that, but I'm just gonna tell you, these bikes make a crap ton of power, and it's super smooth. It's very linear, and I think it is awesome. These things don't vibrate hardly at all. After they counterbalanced the motors in 2017, and now that it's a TPI motor, the power delivery is just smooth and linear. And yeah, it's a little different than the carbureted two-strokes that I have. But honestly, it is so good. And I feel like it just kind of like, you conserve energy by the fact that you don't have all this vibration, and you know exactly where the hit is going to be and how that hit is going to come on. I just love the way that these things run, and I'm always reminded how much time I spend tinkering on the carbureted bikes. Like, I got a carbureted bike right here, and my son's bikes are carbureted, and I spend a ton of time tinkering with those things. I didn't even realize how much I was tinkering with carbureted bikes until I got bikes like this and this, where I'm not tinkering at all with how they run. That's a really big advantage. Something else that's cool that no one really talks about, and that's not exclusive to the XCWs, but the oil reservoirs on these things give you a lot of run time. You can go at least 5 full tanks of fuel on the oil that you put down in that oil reservoir. I've never even ridden it long enough where I had the oil light come on, because after maybe three or so rides, I just put a little oil in it. But you can go for a long, long time on the oil. These things sip oil. I think, based on the research that I've done and the people that I've asked, and me buying oil and then tracking things, I think they're only using about 1 quart of oil, or 1 liter of oil, for every 100 hours of runtime. And I know this because I've asked, I don't say I know this, but I suspect this because I've asked a bunch of guys. I've asked guys that bought their bikes and then bought a specific amount of oil. I had one guy that seriously bought his bike, put 300 hours on it, yes, 300 hours, and he didn't change his top end, 300 hours on the top end and 300 hours on his oil pump, no failures. He bought 4 liters of oil, 4 quarts of oil at the time, and he still had 1 left over, which means he went 300 hours on 3 quarts of oil through his TPI system. Pretty amazing how lean these things are and how little oil they actually take. I already mentioned it, but these things start super great. The 2020s and 2021s are start monsters. They just fire up. They're not cold-blooded, they're awesome, and that's a big improvement over some of the TPI bikes, and it's honestly, it's an improvement over most of my carbureted bikes. These things now start just as easily, just as quick as my carbureted bikes. I know this is a little thing, but you actually get some suspension rings on these bikes. It's those little red, rubber bands or plastic bands that move up and down on the forks. This is typically something that you would only get in an aftermarket situation if you go and pay a suspension guy. I just really like that because it helps me to see how much of the stroke I'm using. It's actually good to be able to bottom your forks out every once in a while, because if you're not bottoming them out, you're just leaving travel on the table. So I love that I have that there, and I can kind of see how much suspension travel I'm using on that front end. Let's talk air filters. This is something that doesn't get talked about enough. The air filter on this bike is toolless. You don't need tools to get your air filter out, which I love, and that's kind of across the board on a lot of the KTMs. And then all of the big bike KTMs, it doesn't matter, 2-stroke, 4-stroke, everything 125 and up is the same. I shouldn't say 125 and up. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm 99% sure that this 125 right here is the same air filter. Yeah, I'm 99% sure. But you go to the 150s, you go to the 200s, the 250s, the 300s, even the 254 stroke, the 354 stroke, the 454 stroke, it's all the same stinking air filter, which is awesome because you can just buy 3 of those air filters or 3 or 4 of those air filters and just be cycling them through, and you don't have to buy a bunch of different sizes in these things if you've got a fleet of bikes, kind of like what I have. Everyone complains about the seats on the KTM, saying the foam is too hard. I will tell you something. The foam on this Kawasaki is harder. The foam on the Betas that I've had is harder. The foam that I've had on the Yamahas is harder. So the seat foam, hey, you either want it too soft or too stiff. That's what everyone wants to say. But these aren't that bad. And then it's 1 bolt to take the seat off, which I kind of like. On some of the other bikes like Kawasaki's and sometimes on my Yamahas and stuff, you have to take 2 bolts out to get the seat off. So 1 bolt is probably the right way to go. You could make it, Beta makes them where it's a push button a lot of times, but then some people have said that they had some problems with their seats flying off in races or hair scramble or something like that. So I think 1 bolt is totally fine for the seat, kind of a good compromise between everything. I like the lock-on grips that you get with the KTM. They come with ODI lock-on grips. Some guys don't like them because they want something a little bit softer, but I like the lock-on grips because it's easy to change them. I have full wraps on this bike. It doesn't come with full wraps. They come with a flag style handguard, just like what this 125 has, which they're actually pretty decent because they'll flex a lot so they don't bend and break. It isn't such a brittle plastic that KTM uses, and so these will give you, it's kind of like one of the best, it's probably the best flag guard that there is in the industry. And so that's a good thing. Obviously you're getting Brembo brakes, you're getting Brembo clutch, you're getting all these super nice components. I've kind of like said that until I'm blue in the face on these bikes, but they are super, super nice on your controls between your clutches. That's another thing, is the clutch levers. They're all interchangeable. The clutch lever on this 125 is the same clutch lever on that 250XE. It's the same clutch lever on this 300XEW. It's the same clutch lever on the 254 stroke, 354 stroke, 454 stroke. So it's pretty cool. A lot of these parts are standardized, and a lot of them will swap over from one bike to the next. So it's just kind of a nice thing in that KTM line. Something else to note that is pretty cool is in 2021, they raised the pipe up even more, kind of curled it back in on itself, and so it doesn't stick out as far on either side. It's kind of got like a corrugated thing on it, so it's got all these, kind of bumps on it. It's actually really, really strong. People have said for a long time that the aftermarket pipes are so much better than the stock pipes, and I'm just here to say that's poppycock. I've tried multiple aftermarket pipes and they're not better. They don't always fit as good, and the metal that they use, I haven't been able to tell that the metal on an aftermarket pipe can take any more abuse than the metal on a stock pipe. I know that's going to be controversial, and some people are going to say, Kyle, that's not true, but that's just been my experience, and I buy a lot of these bikes. I have 3 of them in this room, 3 of the KTMs in this room right now, and I think the stock pipes are amazing. You're not going to get better performance off an aftermarket pipe. You just won't. Some of them make the bikes run slightly different, but for the most part, we're splitting hairs, and it's an awesome pipe on the bike when you get it. The only reason I would say to replace the pipe is if you want to replace the pipe right off the bat, so that then you can put an aftermarket pipe on the bike immediately, and then go back to your stock pipe when you go to sell the bike. That would probably help it to sell faster. But as far as just changing it out to get better performance, you're not gonna get better performance by changing that out. Some things that you might want to add to the bikes. I've got videos that talk about all the things I do. I go through a 60-point checklist with all these bikes as far as tearing them down and checking things out and checking for grease and doing this and that and the other. I've got protection videos. I would say if you're gonna ride these bikes really, really slow through the slow, nasty technical terrain where you're off the bike pushing it and all that stuff, you're probably gonna wanna put a radiator fan on these bikes. It's always been important to have a radiator fan if you're gonna do the slow, nasty technical stuff. But on the TPI bikes, it's even more so because these bikes run so lean in the low RPMs that they do get a little bit hotter, a little bit faster. So think about a radiator fan. Also, maybe think about a rear disc guard down here to protect your rear brake disc. You can put a front disc guard on as well. Also think about a good skid plate. There's some really good aftermarket skid plates out there. SXS is the one I've got on this bike. I've used AXP Extreme on a lot of my other bikes. They're both very, very good skid plates. And so I would look into a really good aftermarket skid plate for this. Depending on how nasty you're gonna get, you might wanna put full wrap handguards on a bike if it's gonna go super gnar. I know handguards are a complicated subject, or a tricky subject for a lot of people, but that's something to think about. You also might want to do some radiator hose protection. I've got videos on that where you can kind of put a little bit of guarding, a little bit of shielding between your radiator hoses and your power valve down there to keep from puncturing. What did I miss? I mean, there's a million things we could talk about with setup, but I won't do that. I've got other videos on that. So that was a lot. We covered a lot there. I'm sorry these videos are so long, but when you're spending this much money, it's nice to get a real world view of some of these things, some of the things that matter. Of course, I can't cover everything in these videos, but I try to cover the main bullet points and the things that I've noticed with these bikes. I love this bike. This is a bike that I don't want to live without right now. So they're really, really cool. If you would like to support Dirt Bike Channel, the best way, pretty much the best way you can do it, is use my links to Rocky Mountain ATV and Amazon and Motorsport. They're down in the links, or they're down in the description of this video. They're also over on my website, dirtbikechannel.com. Upper right hand corner on a web browser, on the computer, it says links up there. If you're on your phone, you just click on the little 3 lines, it drops down the menu, and you've got the links down there. When you click on those links and then go do your shopping as normal, I get a kickback, a referral bonus, especially with Rocky Mountain ATV. Really, really appreciated there. So, okay. That's my review of the 2020 and the 2021 XCW bikes. Everything that I said about the 300 could also be said about the 250. There were just subtle differences, and I didn't really talk anything too specific about the 300 that wouldn't also apply to the 250, because I've got a 250 sitting right there. It just happens to be a 250 XC out of the frame. So, okay, that's what I have for everyone today, and until next time, leave a single track. Thank you.